The Airbnb app is one of the most used for travelers looking to save money due to its wide variety of accommodations that suit different budgets and lifestyles. However, regardless of the place that is rented, it is expected that the owners respect the privacy and space of the tenants and that the tenants comply with the rules established by the owners. This mutual respect is not always maintained, leading to significant issues for both parties. Today, you will learn the story of Ramis Jonuzi, a young man who rented a room in Australia, but unfortunately did not leave the accommodation alive. Ramis Jonuzi was a 36-year-old man who in 2017 temporarily rented a room in a house in Melbourne, Australia. Although this case received widespread attention and was widely discussed in the country, information about Ramis is very scarce. It is only known that he was born on July 24, 1981, in Australia. He had 3 sisters, and that he was an incredibly happy and affectionate boy until he unfortunately fell into drug addiction. At the age of 28, Ramis began dating another man, and they moved in together. Their relationship lasted 8 years, but in its later stages, it became far from perfect. Family and friends reported that before the breakup, Ramis's partner was unfaithful and exhibited various abusive behaviors towards him. At 36, Ramis ended the relationship. Unable to afford rent and other expenses such as energy, water and gas, he decided to move back in with his parents. Leaving home to face the world is not an easy task, but for an adult who once lived independently, returning home can be equally challenging. When we live alone, we develop our own routines and habits, which often end up conflicting with our parents' coexistence, and this was one of the main issues that Ramis faced when he moved back in with his family. Additionally, he was still facing the emotional scars of the breakup, and it was all these difficulties that ended up leading him to drug use. Due to excessive consumption, it didn't take long for Ramis to develop a drug addiction. This situation got so bad that one time one of his sisters had to drag him to the hospital. As a result, Ramis became a very difficult person to live with, which culminated in him being expelled from his parents' home in 2017. Without a place to sleep or a clear direction to follow, Ramis spent a few days sleeping in his car. This caused him severe pain, especially in his spine. It was then that in October, through Airbnb, he found an available room in a house in Brighton East, a suburb of Melbourne 12 kilometres from the city's commercial centre. Airbnb is a company that specialises in connecting people looking for vacation accommodations with property owners. Owners list their properties on the website, and renters typically negotiate directly with them rather than through an agent. This direct interaction often allows renters to find more affordable options, such as renting a spare room in a house without the added costs of employees or additional services. In this specific case, the room at the place was being offered for just $30, which was well below the average price. However, due to Ramis's delicate financial situation, he couldn't afford a better place, and finding no other alternative, he contacted the advertiser. The house had 4 bedrooms and 3 men lived there. The first resident was 37-year-old Ryan Smart. Ryan had an extremely complicated childhood, as his mother was drug addicted and was unable to properly care for him and his sister. Some sources say that Ryan's sister needed special care, was placed in a psychiatric hospital before entering the public adoption system. So, growing up alone with his mother and living a financially unstable life, the young man faced numerous difficulties. He couldn't keep a job for long, he got into a lot of trouble, and it didn't take long for him to fall into the world of drugs, just like his mother. The second resident was 41-year-old Jason Colton. Unlike Ryan, Jason had a healthy and stable childhood, with access to private education and a comfortable financial life. At 20, he started dating a Norwegian woman who was visiting Australia. When she returned to her country, Jason accompanied her, and they lived together in Norway, where they had a son. However, Jason's behavior began to change over time. He became abusive and obsessive towards his partner and frequently got into trouble, including bar fights. His visits to police stations became common, and in 2013, he was arrested for violently attacking his partner. Jason spent 3 months in jail before being deported back to Australia. The third and last resident was Craig Jonathan Levy, 36, who worked as a chef and used drugs almost daily, spending around $250 a week. He was also the host since the house was in his name. The other 2 residents paid rent to live there, so Craig benefited from this, but the common expenses were shared, and so the 4th room in the house was rented to help cover these expenses. Although Craig was the owner, Ryan and Jason handled cleaning the place and sometimes negotiated stays with tenants. So, it was another exchange of favours that benefited everyone there. This wasn't the first time they had advertised the room, and the place had a history of poor feedback from previous rentals. Reviews frequently included complaints and extremely low scores. Many guests reported feeling unwelcome, uncomfortable, or unsafe, with some even stating that their belongings were stolen during their stay. The presence of drugs, alcohol, call girls, and even the police was common. Despite these issues, the affordable price meant the room was almost always rented, which is why Ramis, given his current situation, opted for it. Unfortunately, he didn't realize that what seemed cheap would come at a very high cost. On October 18, 2017, when Ramis arrived at the property, he immediately sensed the negative energy of the residents and the house, but he had no other choice. It was all his limited savings could afford. Initially, the room was rented for 3 nights, the 18th, 19th and 20th, with Ramis scheduled to leave on Saturday, October 21st. However, during his stay, Ramis spoke to Craig and pleaded for an extension, explaining that he couldn't afford more nights and had nowhere else to go. To prove that he wasn't lying, he showed Craig his bank account through the cell phone app, which at the time only had $6. Craig agreed to let him stay until the end of the week, but no longer, as the residents wouldn't be making any money from his extended stay. This allowed Ramis to remain in the house for 2 more days, leaving on Monday morning, October 23rd. During his stay, Ramis would leave in the morning and only return at night. He told the residents that he was looking for a job, but it was very difficult, and that before returning to the place, he would even ask for change on the street so he could buy something to eat. But at the end of these 2 extra days, Craig suddenly changed his mind and charged him for all the days he had spent in the room. Desperate, Ramis explained that he had barely managed to get enough money to feed himself. He showed his bank account balance again, still with the same amount as before, and begged him to stay a little longer. Ramis managed to stay at the house for 2 more days, but the climate became increasingly hostile, and indirectly his stay was becoming a nuisance for the residents. On the morning of the 25th, 7 days after his arrival, Ramis was supposed to leave the property. However, when Craig, Ryan and Jason woke up, they noticed that although he was not in the house, all his belongings were still in the room. Determined to get him out, they resolved to do so by force if necessary. By 6 in the evening, Ramis still hadn't returned. Jason and Ryan decided to go out for a drink at a pub, leaving Craig in charge of evicting Ramis, as he was the one who had created the situation. They warned Craig that if Ramis was still there when they returned, they would handle it themselves. A few minutes later, Ramis arrived. As soon as he entered, Craig confronted him with a much more arrogant and threatening demeanor, insisting that he needed to leave the house that night. Ramis agreed to leave without any trouble, but requested a few hours to take a shower, gather his things, and tidy up the room. Craig reluctantly agreed and went to his room to play video games, occasionally checking on him to ensure he was packing, which he was actually doing, but apparently in a slow manner. A few hours passed until Ramis called Craig to check if everything was okay with the room, as he was finally ready to leave. Craig examined the place, saw that everything was in order, and then asked Ramis for the key. But that was the final straw that escalated the situation. Ramis explained that a few days ago, he had been caught by the police for using drugs on the street. He was taken to the police station where he was booked and had some of his belongings, including his room key, confiscated. When he heard the confession, Craig was furious because he couldn't believe that Ramis, who claimed he didn't have money to pay the rent or to eat, somehow managed to get drugs. Moreover, if that story about the police station was really true, they wouldn't be able to retrieve the key without involving the police, which the 3 residents wanted to avoid at all costs. Craig began cursing Ramis, demanding that he find a way to pay for all the days he stayed, which in this case would be 7 nights, amounting to $210, and he didn't want to hear any more excuses that he only had $6 in his account. Ramis responded by saying that he had worked informally for a few days that week and that he would call his boss to ask for an advance payment. It is not known whether this was actually true, but Ramis paced around the room, persistently on the phone making some calls that seemed to go unanswered. It was already around 9 p.m. when Ryan and Jason arrived. Craig explained the whole situation and the matter infuriated them both. Jason, who was beside himself, went to the bedroom, put Ramis with a rear naked choke and began throwing punches at his face and body. It wasn't long before Craig and Ryan joined in and started doing the same. The young man screamed, begging them to stop, and called for help, but no neighbours came to his aid. There were 3 furious men against 1 dominated individual. As the assault continued, several wounds began to open on Ramis's body, and blood started to drip across the room. Realising that if they dirtied the place, they would not be able to rent it to the next tenant, the 3 men carried Ramis out to the backyard, where the attacks continued. By this time, Ramis was already weak and could barely stand. He fell, and the attacks that were punches became kicks. Craig then took Ramis's cell phone, unlocked it, and began searching for other banking apps or any sources of money that the tenant might be hiding from them. However, he found nothing more than the $6 already shown. He then went to Ramis's room and started going through his things in an attempt to find some hidden money, but again, nothing. After that, Craig did something for which there is currently no plausible explanation. He called the police and explained that his tenant owed a week's rent and that he refused to leave the property. One theory being discussed is that Craig was probably under the influence of drugs and believed he was justified in attacking the guest in that way and expected police to support in charging and evicting the tenant. But, of course, that's not what happened. Meanwhile, Jason went to Ramis's car to search for money or valuables that could be used as payment. He found nothing but a wooden case. He then took this object, returned to Ramis, pulled down his pants, and inserted the entire object into the victim's rectum. After that, Ryan and Jason left Ramis abandoned in the backyard and returned to the house. When the police arrived at the scene, and it is worth noting that Jason and Ryan were unaware that the police had been called, they immediately called the paramedics and tried to keep the victim alive, but by the time the ambulance arrived, there was nothing left they could do. Ramis was officially announced deceased at 9:15 p.m, and Craig, Ryan and Jason were arrested and charged with murder. The autopsy report revealed that the cause of death was internal bleeding. Additionally, several types of illicit drugs were found in Ramis's body, leading the doctor to assume that these substances might have lessened his suffering. During the trial, a neighbor testified that she had heard Ramis's cries for help, but chose not to get involved because the residents were already known for causing chaos in the neighborhood. However, she admitted that she could have at least made an anonymous call to the police. Just like in the case that I already presented here on the channel, terror at Lululemon, employees at an Apple store heard sounds of things breaking and exaggerated screams from two women in the store next door. In this case, Lululemon, but they preferred not to do anything because they assumed it was just a fight between friends. The next morning, they found out about the crime that had occurred. The employee's inaction failed to save a life. Exactly the same thing happened in Ramis's case. Craig, Ryan and Jason pleaded guilty to manslaughter when there is no intent to kill. The three also claimed that their actions were actually a reaction to an alleged attack by Ramis, who they said had used a wrench to try to assault them after being charged for the additional days. However, this defense was refuted, as none of the three had any injuries, and the brutality of their actions far exceeded any plausible claim of self-defense. Jason further claimed that despite not having the intention to kill, Ramis deserved everything that happened because he had not shown any respect as a guest. As soon as he was about to compliment his comment, Jason was quickly interrupted by the public defender, as this statement, of course, would only harm his case. Although the three men participated equally in the crime, their sentences varied. Craig was sentenced to 8 years, Ryan to 9 years, and Jason to 13 years. All sentences were to be served in full. Ramis was struggling with severe drug addiction. He had been kicked out of his home and apparently didn't even have money to eat. While he may have overstayed his welcome and exceeded some ethics or good conduct by staying on the property for an extra period, he did it with the host's permission. Regardless, nothing justifies physical aggression he endured. By physically attacking the victim, Craig, Ryan and Jason lost any moral high ground they might have had. Now, despite some believing their sentences were too lenient, they will pay for their actions behind bars. We express our deepest sympathies to the victim's family. If you've made it this far, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to this channel. Also, add your opinion in our comments. I will see you in the next case.